Very briefly, just to introduce Neil, he's senior lecturer in law and head of department at the Open University, chair of the Sanctuary Advisory Network at the OU. Neil's research interests are within immigration law, asylum law, human rights, and well-being. His PhD concerned assessing how human rights are upheld during the time individuals are held for police interviews. He's currently working on several projects in the fields of immigration and asylum, and the principal investigator in a British Academy Leverhulme funded project, which looks at the legal consciousness of search and rescue volunteers who save the lives of people making dangerous crossings in the Mediterranean. And I think he's going to be speaking about that today. So over to you, Neil, and yeah, looking forward very much to hearing your talk.
Thank, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for turning up this evening, or sorry, this afternoon. So the title of this session is Control and Criminalisation of Search and Rescue in the Mediterranean. This did start off as a BI Leverhulme project about legal consciousness. I'm not really going to talk about legal consciousness in this presentation. That was part of the project, and subsequently we've written a paper which is now off for review in respect of it. This was the other part of the project, which looks at control and criminalisation. Before I start, it's worthwhile maybe pointing out that two colleagues were involved in writing this paper as well. Dr. Matt Howard, who was at the OU, and Joe Vincent, who was also at the OU, who are respectively at the University of Kent and John Moores University in Liverpool as well. And I was just going to say, this image at the beginning, credit to CI for this. We actually use this. We have a search and rescue open learn create course which introduces people to the law of the sea, which is designed for search and rescue workers, and it was part of the project that we designed this course, so that was kind of costed into the project, and is available for individuals to learn about the law in relation to search and rescue who are volunteers in the Mediterranean. So you can find that. I probably should have had the link, but you can find that just by typing search and rescue Neil Graffin open learn create into Google anyway. So, and I just think this is a particularly striking image. I guess the sense of absence in the image really encapsulates what this presentation is going to be about, really. Okay, so again, the background, it sought to understand how search and rescue workers who save the lives of people who make dangerous crossings navigate and understand the law. It sought to satisfy a qualitative empirical research, the legal knowledge of understanding of SAR workers through the lens of legal consciousness and how they were subject to control and criminalisation. Most of the research in law, at least, but most of the research in social sciences and political science as well, tends to focus in on criminalisation. We wanted to focus in on other mechanisms of control. So this is really the subject of this paper. I will talk about criminalisation as being one of the sub-themes in relation to this, but it's really the other mechanisms of control that are the focus of the article that's come out of this. So we conducted semi-structured interviews of 22 volunteer SAR workers. We adopted a reflexive thematic analysis of the data. We contacted a range of organisations, from small organisations to larger organisations working in the Mediterranean, both in relation to the Central Mediterranean and Eastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean as well. We also spoke to a small amount of people who were working on the Channel crossing. At the time of the research, which was around 2021, the Channel crossing was becoming more established as a route, so we felt it necessary to contact those individuals as well. So we had conversations about their experience, and we encouraged individuals to reflect on those experiences. So for context, before I get into the sub-themes, it's worthwhile noting the kind of human rights issues that were discussed, because this will become apparent later on when I begin to actually ask why does this happen? Why are people subject to control and criminalisation? So the types of human rights issues discussed within the different interviews included predominantly not performing adequate search and rescue, Coast Guards assaulting migrants, Coast Guards not attending to the medical care of migrants, migrant vessels being shot at, particularly in relation to Libya, for example, tampering with or removing the engines from migrant vessels, setting them adrift. Pushbacks. Pushbacks involve basically coercing vessels back into the territorial waters of Libya or Turkey, for example, where they're outside of EU waters. So that will happen, it could happen very directly, for example, but a lot of the time Coast Guards will perform dangerous maneuvers to kind of force vessels to turn around and go back into the territorial water of Libya or whatever it might be. And this was discussed in a lot of interviews. High levels of violence used in these pushbacks and how they put people's lives at risk, as you can imagine. And one participant even mentioned, if you can call this a pushback, but pushbacks happening when people had landed on shore. So they discussed how one individual had actually landed in Greece and subsequently turned up in Turkey. Okay. So that's the context in relation to sort of human rights violations. What we found in the research was that various mechanisms of control were being discussed by participants. Now, this is a contested area of law, so states will have their own view as to whether, this is a mechanism of control or whether they're just trying to make search and rescue organizations abide by their own laws or regulations or international law or whatever it might be. But it was perceptions of SAR volunteers that we focused on. And the key themes in relation to methods of control that emerged from this were bureaucracy and the local use of the civil law, requirements imposed for search and rescue vessels to launch and or disembark, detaining vessels for inspection, detaining vessels for contagion control or quarantining vessels, and also criminalisation. And what we argue is that the types of methods that are being discussed, the aim of these methods in the perception of SAR volunteers is to deter, disrupt, delegitimize, and de-operationalize SAR work. So, okay. So theme one is bureaucracy and the use of the civil law. So a lot of these mechanisms might actually appear to be fairly innocuous, but I'll explain the perception of SAR volunteers afterwards. So the types of bureaucratic tasks that SAR organizations faced included registration requirements with authorities, including having to have documents translated by an official translator and having these stamped and apostilled, registering their NGO with the local mayor, obtaining licenses and permits, getting insurance, and making daily reports to the Coast Guard. Okay, they seem fairly innocuous on the whole of it, and you maybe might expect some of these things. However, SAR volunteers basically indicated that these the amount of requests that were being made for them, repeated requests for the same information, effectively amounted by implication as a form of bureaucratic harassment, effectively. The idea of which was to slow down SAR organisations to make it more difficult for them to operate and to drain their resources. So a couple of quotes here. We very quickly came to the realisation that one piece of bureaucracy wasn't working, that they changed the goalposts. Interview one. At that point, we weren't really aware of how much paperwork they would come to like. I went and said, this boat is coming, here's the crew. But then once you're in the water, they ask you, where's the insurance? Where is that? This. And I was like, you already have it. And that was the beginning of knowing that you have to send stuff again and again. And there were various comments along these lines that individuals were constantly being harassed, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean. In addition to these time and resource-consuming jobs. Participants discussed the difficulties they had they faced complying with local laws. So they were issued, again, mostly in the Eastern Mediterranean, but they were issued with fines, and this may have been directly linked to SAR work, such as conducting aspects of SAR operations without direct authorization from the Coast Guard, which we'll discuss in the next theme. Or it could be unrelated, such as fines for picking up litter, and we'll see that in the next quote. So beach clean fines, removing litter from the beach without having a license to do so, which seems very odd. And then various petty stuff, which probably wasn't fair because they weren't true. Navigating without lights on, they'd accuse us of certain stuff like that. And we did have lights on because they wanted to deter. Again, this is about deterrence and disruption. Deter us from what we were doing. In their opinion, by rescuing the migrants, it didn't suit their policy of border enforcement. And they can't actually fine us for doing rescues because I presume we're covered under maritime law. So they would find other minor infringements that would just be a pain in the bum and financially costly once they add up over a period of time. Particularly for smaller organisations, small fines can have a large impact because a lot of the time they're operating on the shoestring. They're having to fundraise and potentially to pay for certain fines because they really don't have money. Some other organisations have better resources, albeit I don't think any humanitarian NGO is particularly well financed on the Mediterranean. Theme 2 included requirements imposed for SAR vessels to launch and or disembark. It's worthwhile talking a bit about the law here. Under Article 17 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, foreign ships enjoy the right to innocent passage over the territorial waters of another state. This includes departure from internal waters or ports under Article 18, subsection 1b. So they can depart, foreign vessels can depart. However, Section 21, subsection 1 provides that states may adopt laws in conformity with the provision of this convention and other rules of international law for the safety of navigation and the regulation of maritime traffic, and notably for the prevention of the infringement of customs, fiscal, immigration or sanitary laws and regulations of the coastal state. Okay, so they can depart from the internal waters, but it's subject to immigration, sanitary laws and other regulations of the coastal state. In Greece, SAR vessels were denied access to depart because local regulations prevented foreign pleasure vessels from travelling, as foreign search and rescue vessels were classed as without authorization, but this didn't apply to local vessels. So you may wonder why they're classed as pleasure vessels. There's different classifications for many types of boats, and it's a really complicated regime. But it just happened to be that they weren't being classed as search and rescue vessels. They had this kind of classification of pleasure vessels, and I guess that was a mechanism to be able to control those vessels that bit more. So you can imagine this is a search and rescue vessel. They've got lives at risk at sea that they're aware about because they've got spotters on land, and the spotters have seen that there's a vessel in distress. If that happened in the UK, for example, it would be an emergency response. RNLI would be straight out to attend to that situation. That couldn't happen in Greece. They would have to ask for permission from the Coast Guard to then go out. So if there were people in, Dire Straits or whatever it might be, that they would be in a position whereby loss of life was potentially at risk because they were having to ask for the Coast Guard, and sometimes they weren't getting permission from the Coast Guard as well, as the next quotes will attest to. So the biggest control measure that they put in, which really impinged on our ability to do some really good work and lunch in good time, to preempt what we knew was going to be or was a developing situation, was that they had to give us permission to lunch. Sorry. Without that, we just stood there and waited and waited and waited. On more occasions than most, we didn't get that permission to lunch, but when we did, we were grateful. Yes, sir, no, sir, staying well inside the perimeters of what they allowed us to do. This last quote is relevant to our other paper because what we found in that particular paper is that search and rescue organisations seek out to comply as best as they possibly can with states. So whatever the Coast Guard tells them to do, they will do it because they don't want to jeopardize their ability to kind of continue to perform that work. But for the purposes of this particular paper, you can see here that this was a major control mechanism being used by the state. So you probably have come across quite high-profile cases, such as the case of Carola Rackete, for example, in Sea-Watch 3, about vessels being denied access to disembarkation. So they're not allowed to go into ports, for example. So we saw that in relation to Sea-Watch 3, where they wanted to dock in Lampedusa, but at the time Salvini had closed all Italian ports to humanitarian NGOs. And there was a subsequent court case in relation to this when the boat actually entered the harbour, or court cases, I should say, because then Salvini came in front of the courts in relation to it. Article 25 of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea confirms the rights of states to regulate access to their internal waters, and this includes being able to check whether vessels comply with port entry requirements and deny ships entry which fail to comply. As a general rule, this means that states have no obligations to open ports to foreign vessels. Okay, pardon me. So they don't need to do it. But they are obliged under maritime law, and they are obliged under human rights law to ensure the safety of individuals at sea. UNCLOS and the SAR Convention indicate that disembarkation may occur, but it just does not specify where. The International Maritime Organization have issued guidelines to recommend that the preferred destination should be the destination point at disembarkation. So if you set off for the port of Lampedusa, you should be able to disembark there, but it's only a recommendation. It's not hard law. Okay, so this is kind of a bit of a legal loophole in relation to this, which obviously causes issues. For SAR organizations, it causes major human rights issues effectively, and we saw this particularly in relation to COVID as well, where boats were being kept out to sea for a long period of time. Trying to be mindful also of the fact that we're in a pandemic, keep crews safe, keep rescue people safe. We were basically being held in a state of limbo for an extended period of time. We started to run out of water, started to run out of food. It became increasingly difficult on the ship to keep things calm because people were obviously very scared about the fact that they think maybe they were going to be taken back to Libya. And so they're threatening to jump in the water because they'd rather die. And all the while, we're sending emails to maritime authorities asking for a place of safety in order that we can disembark. This came up in a few participant accounts where suicide was mentioned when boats were being held out at sea and they're on a kind of holding pattern trying to get permission to dock somewhere. Part of the sort of, as explained by one participant, part of the sort of really stressful aspect of this was that they didn't want to be taken back to, say, Libya in this case, but they could also see that they had got so close to where they wanted to be. It caused them lots of stress, and then also by virtue of the fact that they're on a boat going round in circles or sitting for periods of time in obviously very stressful circumstances. Theme 3 relates to something which we're taking hopefully further in our research in relation to this, because it's a predominant method of control at the moment, which is detaining vessels for inspections. So this is where vessels are detained for inspection by port state control. It's worthwhile maybe speaking a bit about the law in relation to this, because it's not 100% clear, or it hasn't been 100% clear until recently around whether SAR vessels should be subjected to port state control, but there is clarity from the EU now in relation to it. So the legal framework regarding maritime safety and marine environmental protection includes such instruments as UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law on the Sea, and several conventions adopted under the International Maritime Organization. That it's a very long or very complicated, complex sort of system where boats are subject to various types of regulations to ensure that they're up to standard, that they're not going to pollute the environment, and all of this type of stuff. So you can see that from key conventions such as the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, and the International Convention on Standards of Training, Certification and Watchkeeping for Seafarers 1978. But there's lots of different conventions, and you'll find them all under on the IMO's, the International Maritime Organization's website, relating to such things as preventing collisions, facilitating maritime traffic, oil pollution, dumping of waste, etc. When a SAR vessel comes into port, they will be looking to find out whether it complies with this rather complex legal framework, mostly looking at considering whether it has relevant health and safety sort of certification, that it meets, it's not going to pollute the environment, and there's various things there that would be required, okay, to ensure that the vessels aren't substandard. I should point out flag states. So every ship has a flag. So you'll see that if you see a sailing ship or whatever it might be, you'll see it might hoist a Union Jack, or it might hoist an Irish flag or a Norwegian flag, or whatever it might be. Flag states have the primary responsibility for safeguarding against substandard ships, which are unsafe or could pollute the environment. However, for a long time, and there's a long history with regards to this in maritime law, some vessels would have taken a flag of convenience, which means that effectively they would have taken a flag which allowed them to get away with the fact that their ship wasn't up to scratch. So port state control came in as another mechanism to control vessels and to make sure that they met the relevant requirements within mostly Europe, but there are other signatories to what is known as the Paris Memorandum, which has now been codified into EU law. The recent case, and this case came out after our research, the recent case of Sea-Watch, and I'll not embarrass myself by trying to pronounce this in Italian, so I'll just say the Sea-Watch case, considered whether port state controls should be subjected to vessels performing search and rescue. The reason that was a question is previously it had only been commercial vessels, and then subsequently it started to apply to fishing vessels, but only very recently. So Sea-Watch basically said that, first of all, we shouldn't be subjected to this form of port state control because we're not a commercial vessel, we're not a fishing vessel. But the court held that they can be subjected to port state control after assistance has been rendered. But the court specified that to do so, the port state must demonstrate that there are serious indications of a danger to health and safety, on-board working conditions, or the environment. And they have the power to adopt corrective measures, meaning that they have the power to ask vessels to perform certain things to make sure they're up to standard. But these measures must be suitable, necessary, and proportionate. Now, what we found, if you can keep these kind of underlined comments in mind, because what we found is that the measures were often not serious, and the corrective measures were often not suitable, necessary, and proportionate. But first of all, it's probably worth pointing out that SAR vessels are not really designed for such purposes. The majority of them are not RNLI vessels, as you might imagine a SAR vessel would look like. They are, if you take a look at some of the main vessels, which you can find a list of, the Fundamental Human Rights Agency of the EU have a list of the vessels from at least 2022. You can then kind of match them on the Maritime Traffic Database, which for a nerd like myself is, fun to find out a bit about these vessels. But and you can match them up and find out what they actually were. And some of them were things like offshore supply vessels. You've got other vessels which were cargo ships, for example, but they've been repurposed for search and rescue. But many of these ships are very old, so you might imagine that they could fall down with regards to MARPOL, which concerns pollution, for example. However, it's perceived by participants that they're obviously working in an emergency situation, and that calls for emergency measures. And what they argue is that, first of all, that's not being taken account, that's not being accounted for, but also they're being asked to comply with additional requirements which go above and beyond what other vessels have to comply with. So, for example, one participant highlighted, no other ship that performs or should perform rescues, like the Italian Coast Guard, Maltese Coast Guard, Spanish Coast Guard, military ships, nobody's being requested about this. I mean, when you rescue people at sea, everyone assumes that's an emergency situation, and since you're not a ferry or anything like that, you shouldn't have to comply with all of that stuff. Okay, and we saw this in other comments as we go through. So this particular person, some of the background of some of the volunteers was that they had worked in search and rescue backgrounds, or that they had worked in commercial backgrounds in the past. So we kind of got an interesting sort of take from both sides, and you can see it in this particular comment. It's systematic for us to have port state control when we disembark people in Italy. This is talking about search and rescue. And this kind of control by the state never happens each time the commercial ships touch the ground in any country of the world. When I navigate a commercial ship as a seafarer, I did not expect and fear the port state control each time I go on port. The regulations seem to be the same for everyone, but not for us. It's the SAR vessels. It's really, really more. Okay. So in terms of serious indications of a danger to health and safety on board working conditions of the environment, what the participants discussed were often not very serious. So examples of non-compliance included authorities finding that items and vessels were out of date. This included maps. In one example, by a week, where the map was of lighthouses, which you can imagine they're probably unlikely to change, and they're actually using digital copies anyway. Pyrotechnics or fire extinguishers. Other examples of non-compliance included stickers not being in items, or in one case having too many life jackets on board. And this, as interview 6 said, so really just completely ridiculous. And there are other examples that we discuss in our paper. Interview 6 again, they were concerned about the well-being of rescued people in terms of sewerage facilities. We are talking about people who were rescued from the imminent risk of drowning. Then you held these people at sea for almost 2 weeks after the event. This was in relation to a quarantine during COVID. And now you're concerned that when they're on board, maybe they won't have sufficient hygiene facilities. The level of hypocrisy, it just blows your mind. Interview 13 was a bit more generous in relation to this particular point. Although they also did recognise that port state control were going above and beyond in relation to search and rescue than they were other vessels. But they said, if you have a 1940s fishing trawler going out to sea to provide sea rescue, it's got to be fit for purpose. And if your sole purpose is to go out and save 300-400 people, you've got to have the right sewage systems. You've got to have X amount of toilets, because you have to provide for these people. You have to give those people dignity, and you also have to comply with that legislation, whether you like it or not. Okay. But again, as I said, this person said, well, SAR vessels are still being asked to perform more than what is the case for commercial vessels. So the last theme is criminalisation, and hopefully I have enough time to kind of go through this. But so this was ever present in discussions, and the atmosphere of criminalisation was also really apparent. So a lot of people, like we had one discussion, which I don't mention here, but one discussion around a particular place name where people were performing search and rescue from, and they talked about this place name fever, and it was kind of this sort of oppressive anxiety that was contagious between individuals, like a fever. So something would happen, and then everybody, all of the SAR volunteers would start to get really panicked and really anxious and really worried. And that was a result of the pressure that was being created by the law, by the state authorities' actions, about the fear of being criminalised. So it was ever present in discussions that participants were cognizant of the wider political culture, and they knew of instances of criminalisation. So the bigger picture is that criminalisation was coming from some very heavy politicians, and in my opinion, and the government leaders, and we weren't invincible if they decided to crack down on us. They were mostly concerned about being arrested for people smuggling, which is what, you know, likes of Salvini and others had sort of accused individuals of in the past. That appeared to be and also people had been prosecuted for it as well, such as likes of Sean Binder, for example. That appeared to be the predominant mode of criminalisation. But others mentioned that they were concerned about being arrested for spying, as well as money laundering, because accusations had historically been made against SAR organisations in relation to that. Again, the kind of atmosphere that this creates is really oppressive. So very draining. You're constantly up against a level of animosity, whether that's explicit or low-key in the guise of public health rhetoric or poor state control, whatever it might be, it really chips away at you after a while. And a lot of SAR volunteers would have stayed for a period of time and they would have left and would have come back because it was very emotionally draining on them to perform this work. Another volunteer spoke of their initial naivety regarding SAR work, putting a lot of trust in the SAR organisation they worked for, but realising over time the issues regarding criminalisation, including witnessing their friends being arrested, as well as the difficult political situation they found themselves in. It was something they described as scary, nerve-wracking, and ultimately led them to leaving SAR humanitarian work and doing something completely different. So those are the kind of key themes. I should say in relation to criminalisation and the other themes, you can see through them, you know, it's to disrupt, it's to hold people back, it's to deter them from working in this field. And in relation to detaining them, detaining vessels, de-operationalising them, to stop them actually from performing SAR work. The predominant thing in relation to criminalisation is it's a mode of deterrence. It's a perceived mode of deterrence for this type of work. And it does, as this individual sort of suggested, it really chips away at you after a period of time. And it does deter individuals over a period of time because they aren't given adequate support. They're performing very traumatic work and having to deal with everything else basically on top of that, from, you know, the macro level political issues to the fines, to what's happening on the ground, to the fear of them or their friends being arrested. So what we argue in the paper is about deterrence, disruption, de-operationalization, and another word that I've just forgotten. So yes, so why does this happen? So in the perception of SAR volunteers, and this is my last slide really, it's to control the waters. They want nobody to be there and they want to be able to perform pushbacks, and they don't really want individuals to see that that's actually happening. What also became apparent in our research is that not only do SAR organisations think that they're performing life-saving work, but they act as a human rights observer on the Mediterranean. They want to document what is going on so that can be used to try and improve the situation, and SAR workers find that very important. How they document that is another question, but for our other paper really. They want to control the narrative, they want to prevent that observation of human rights breaches, and they want to silence criticism. So these are the sorts of reasons why they feel that they're being controlled. Okay, and this is the last slide. At the end, they don't want to take us out of the area for what they say, this pull factor, because basically it's been proven that's a lie. They want us out because we denounce what's going on. When we're witnessing pushbacks or anything like that, we also denounce what's going on, and that's what they don't want. They don't want us in the area, so nobody knows what's going on there. And they grounded the civil surveillance aircraft precisely because they're the ones that are calling out the fact that there's been a shipwreck, there's been a pushback, there's been a body drifting in this dinghy for 15 days and nobody's recovering this person. Otherwise, the Central Mediterranean is a black hole, to speak of information, and they would much prefer it to be that way. It's better that we're not there. It's better we're not calling them out in their shit. So that's it. So I just thank you very much for listening today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Neil. It's so interesting. Terrific insight.